Hey, welcome. Happy half hour to you. So glad that you're joining me. My name is Susie Schultz. I'm the executive director of the Museum of Broadcast Communication. And here is these are the happy half hour chimes. They, of course, are the NBC chimes and one of the wonderful artifacts that we have at the Museum of Broadcast Communication. Unfortunately, you can't go there right now. You can't physically go there, but you can go there online. And we have created not only on our website, museumtv.com, .org, but we also have a new website called greatdebates.org. And for many of you, it's not new. Hopefully, it's something that you've been using and following, but it is really talking about the impact of broadcast, the different industries in broadcast, whether it's television, radio, or online, and the effect that it's had on the presidential race. We have seen this amazingly this week. We have a 100-year-old timeline there. Thanks very much to Andrea Stone, the author of that. And then we have sample articles about when the broadcast industry's evolution disrupted the campaigns. Because think about it, nowhere is that disruption, as this technology has changed, really more apparent because there's that 4-year gap, of course, between all the presidential races. And so you see them trying to adapt, trying to change. And then we have curriculum guides, which we are so grateful. Gretchen Patrick, Carol Summerfield, myself co authored. Gretchen did a phenomenal job. And we are so grateful. There's 8 different modules up, and they are meant for high school and middle school students, but they are also meant for lifelong learners and parents. We hope teachers are taking advantage of them, and we are updating them regularly. So there are new things if you haven't checked in. And today we thought what we would do is we would really do a check in. We have been talking after each of the presidential debates, and we would like to really do a check in now that there has been, at least the media has called these races. We have a president elect, but we are still going into the process. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the week that was and the week that is coming up. And we are very lucky to be able to do that today with 2 guests. Carol, how are you? This is Carol
I
Summerfield.
am good.
And Carol has a guest with her, don't you?
I
Carol
do.
has a
There is a 4-year-old who has been, threatened in order to stay off of the camera and out of sound. Um, you may lean in right now, and then that's it. Okay. There you go.
and that's
That's so.
Sophie. So grateful to see Sophie. It's really lovely. And then we have another guest who everybody knows. Hello, Mr. Kermit. It's so good. He is the head of Lewis University's history department, correct? And tell us what else you
Correct.
do, Mr. Dr.
I
Dennis Dunn.
also direct the Lewis University History Center. We do outreach. I manage a history collection that focuses on the history of the I&M Canal. And also, we're involved in a fair amount of community projects with our students.
Oh, that's really wonderful. That's really wonderful. And you're the reason that we met Gretchen, which is great, which is great. And Carol, I forgot to say that you run your own museum, correct? Would you tell everybody a little bit about that?
I do. I'm the head of the History Center of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, and our goal is to basically demonstrate how sort of the sociology of community. How do communities form when they do form where they are? How do they manage to survive? Then how do they thrive? And how does that change over time? And it's really comparing both Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, but then looking at it as emblematic of a much larger national narrative.
Got it. Wonderful. This is great. And we've been lucky enough to have both of you several times after the different debates to talk really about, because our whole goal here on these programs is to talk to parents and teachers about how to teach this. It's been very disruptive. It's been very crazy. We knew that it would be an election like no other. And it's continued to prove that. And so, not only we're in the midst of a pandemic, but one of the really powerful and wonderful things to come out of all of this is the largest vote that we've ever had. Isn't that correct, Dennis? This is the largest vote.
Absolutely. I think it's the highest percentage since I think 1904. And the largest total number of votes ever. So really a spectacular showing.
Yeah, it is. I was listening to somebody today who was saying that, of course, President-elect Biden did get the most number of votes, but that President Trump could also warm himself in the idea that he got the second highest vote total in the history of the country, which is pretty
Mhm.
amazing. So that's one thing. And what are some of the other unique things that we've been going through this week, Carol? We all really know what they are, but just slightly to review.
Well, I think that there's some really interesting things that have come out of witnessing what we're watching play out. And that is a lot of how we actually tally and count and validate the election is usually very backdoor behind the scenes. There's not a lot of visibility to it because unless the election is significantly close, all of it becomes invisible. And one of the things that we're witnessing now with the whole, well, it's not official. Well, it's never official until the actual electoral college votes. And that's the whole thing is that we lose sight, I think, and have lost sight collectively over time that the process is we vote in electors. So Illinois' electors will vote for Joe Biden because he won Illinois, but they haven't voted yet. And that's one of the things that we're waiting on. And so, really, that is the moment in which the election becomes official. And broadcast has done some really interesting things. You know, it was for a very long time, you wouldn't have known for days, right, through the early 1900s who won, that this was all sort of part of the whole methodology of trotting people out to Washington, D.C., voting and then sending them back to announce.
Mhm.
So the speed of it is still jarring, I think, to people. And I think that I think like the latest state that has a referendum on when they decide is like the 12th. So we're still not even there yet.
So yeah, and I think the speed became something that grabbed momentum as television became, of course, more accessible to everybody. Radio, I think it is interesting when was it KDK in Philadelphia started. It was when radio actually kicked off. It was during an election, and they started the very first broadcast basically saying, "Is anybody out there listening?" Um, but to tally results, and as things have moved along, we got to the point where it was just ridiculous. In 1980, 1984, they were calling the election on the networks before people had voted, when they were out on the East Coast, before people had voted on the West Coast. And I think there were some studies done, and questionable studies, but they said that actually in 84, they believe there was about 16% of people who just walked out of line because the vote had already been tallied according to what they were hearing on the television. But yeah, the process is arduous, isn't it, Dennis? It's really detailed.
Well, and I think in the past, at least in my lifetime, and this is going back to I think my first election was 1980. The idea that there was kind of abstract that your vote is important and your vote matters. And it really felt like with this election, and I would credit former President Obama with this insight that um, you have to make a plan, you have to dedicate yourself to voting. Um, Donald Trump really showed a great ability to mobilize his base and get
Mhm.
them out to vote. And we can see all of those votes out there. But then also the Biden votes were also extremely motivated to get out. And I think people saw that these small actions are no longer abstract. And I think the real difference this time is going to be in this mail-in ballot category, and how that might change how we look at voting in the future and might lead to some sort of conversation about electronic voting from home. Somebody said the other day, if I can do banking from home, I should be able to vote for somebody from home.
So I this year I was an election judge, and what amazed me. Now I've been a political reporter and I've been a political editor for a chunk of my career. I have covered elections, and there were things that I just didn't know, because again, it is so, Carol, as you said, it's very much in the back door. It's very much things that we don't pay attention to because we don't have to. And I always thought that I understood exactly what provisional ballots were. I didn't. I really didn't. And as we're going to the count, provisional ballots are the things that really. they are, for the most part, a way to make sure that people who have not gone through the process in a correct way at least get a shot at voting. So if you walk in and you walk into the wrong precinct, we are technically, Cook County in our training told us, the city Chicago Board of Elections, we are not allowed to say it's going to be hard for this vote to count. I just want you to know if you're in the wrong precinct. So we would urge people to go to the right precinct, but if they decided they wouldn't, we had to give them a provisional ballot, and there has to be an affidavit. And at the end of the day, all of them go in an envelope. They're sealed up, signatures are taken, and those envelopes, when you think about that through the whole process from all the precincts, those envelopes are never even touched unless the election is close. And then they are ballots that will eventually be disputed as well. So they take a long time. If we're counting everything, they take a long time to count. And I thought that was really interesting this week to watch how this played out on television. Very much like in '88 when we were dealing with, I'm sorry, in 2000 when we were dealing with the Gore Bush, and we had, we got a schooling in hanging chads and what that meant. Um, I wonder how many parents and how many teachers were able to take advantage of this week as an educational moment. Carol, you think it is a moment we could have seized on?
Oh, absolutely. Just as I think 2000 was.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I had an early experience about sort of the value of a single vote in Ann Arbor. And it was the year, I think, before I could vote. The mayor lost by 1 point, by one vote, one. And it was one of those things where, and again, at that point, I was highly politically active and working on campaigns and stuff. So I was really heavily involved. And to go through that whole process of what's a provisional ballot, when do we actually know, when's the final count in, it's fascinating to sort of help students, I think, back up and understand all the different thing that goes into authenticating an election. And one of the things that we lose sight of as we get into the criticisms of our election is we are still considered sort of a gold standard, that everything that we go through, the various validation processes, mean that people do or are seriously unlikely to get in there and illegally vote. It is a lightning strike rare occurrence. And that's a thing that I think we lose sight of.
We opened up the ballot at 6. We opened up the precinct at 6 a.m. And there was many of us. There was 6 of us working a precinct along with a coordinator. So that's 7 people working this small area. And some of us were very new. And as the line was out the door and down the block, I there was a little part of me that wanted to get it going, get it going, get it going, and was annoyed because I could not do what I did until the station before me finished its 2-step process. They could not do what they did until the station before them finished. And this was signed, and this was put in a book, and this was numbered, and then the ballots were signed and they were handed out. And as I walked home, I thought, I was just, because I was annoyed in the morning, but I didn't say anything. We just plowed through. And in the afternoon, as I was walking home that evening after we had finished everything, I actually had a moment of real pride when I, was able to ponder long enough to kind of go, wait a minute, this would have been almost impossible to break into this and change these ballots and to do anything. I cannot see how that process was so arduous and so detailed that it was pretty amazing. It was pretty amazing. So how did you think, Dennis, that the news media did over this week in covering things?
It was fascinating. I think in a period where many of us have anxiety over the pandemic, I think the length of time waiting for the vote also produced, from many reports, anxiety. But I was actually impressed by the media and their ability to wait to call this election. And actually, all of those, if I find it interesting, all of those cameras in the processing areas of people opening up envelopes, putting them through machines. I loved watching that. And I loved watching who was in the room, right? It's important who's in the room. And I spent a lot of time just looking at these people in the background. The supervisor would come by. At least that's how I was reading it. And then these people are just moving paper, moving paper. And each one. So I think they did a good job, especially with the holding off and then this kind of what I think of as like a fireplace. I just couldn't take my side off of this processing of ballots.
It was fascinating, and I we do things are rancorous. We know things are still unfolding. The president, of course, is disputing the validity of the voting process, and even the Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate today, said he stands by the president in that dispute. Yes, we have President-elect Biden moving ahead and choosing a committee to look into the pandemic and to deal with the strategy for it. Um, but I think because it is such an angst time, Dennis, we do think that this is the only time, right? This is the moment. It's never been like this, which is truth, but it has been rancorous in the past, hasn't it?
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. And again, I always bring us back to thegreatdebates.org and this idea of looking at some of the lesson plans and looking at the role that the media has played. And we come back to this that the way that they're reporting the information, the positioning of the candidates, all has a role in how we perceive this election. Um, and so I think there's these incredible resources, especially I like the timeline and then going back and actually seeing the debates. The video clips are just amazing. So if you're watching this and you haven't done it, wait until we finish, but then go directly to greatdebates.org.
And we are updating everything on a regular basis, thanks to Andrea Stone. She has been putting up all sorts of things about the debates as it goes through. About the we're going to do some more things on the vote, and but Carol, thinking about going back into history as well, where is it you think we can plumb to actually show students a little bit more about one, where the vote matters, again, rancor, how social media deals with this? What are some of the things that you think we might be teachers might be able to use, or parents?
Well, I do think that there is a really interesting comparison to the years in which, the goal of the broadcast media was to declare a winner as soon as possible. And there was, what people considered voter suppression on the West Coast because, if they swung the eastern states and they thought, well, we know how California is going to go, they were declaring it. And you can go back and you can actually show students what some of that criticism looks like of ABC, NBC, and CBS, and it shifted how they managed the results. And I think that you can sort of look at this narrowing of the narrative. I think that part of the reason that you didn't see anybody willing to call it on election night this year is because of the Al Gore issue in 2000 when they called Florida and then they had to roll it back and they rolled it back at like 3 a.m. So a whole bunch of people went to bed thinking, all right, President Gore, including I think President Gore, and then Vice President Gore, and then we're when we look at the rancor around it, and when you look at sort of the disinformation campaign, I think you have to go back farther. I think that there was really significant, disinformation campaign. And again, you can look at Chicago, that the old running joke, vote early and vote often, right? That there was this whole idea that you could actually just filter people through a voting area and that somebody would stand outside to hand you $10 to basically vote the way they wanted you to. That there we are built on this sort of foundational story that there was corruption within our voting system, and over the years and over the decades they've really worked to tighten it up.
They really have. I
Then
think, what was was it Brokaw who said, "We don't just have egg on our face; we have a full omelet." After the mistake in Florida, and I know that many of the president's supporters have been talking about how to look and take lessons from what happened there and from the recount, to actually deal with their legal strategy as they move ahead, which I think. Few people are actually on board with actually calling it a strategy. Isn't that accurate? It's It's not, we don't want to get partisan here. We are a 501(c)(3), but I
Mhm.
believe the way it's been analyzed is that it's been much more reactive and that there is not a clear strategy of how they're fighting different things. So the stuff that has to play out in the courts already, I think, Carol, before we came on, you were talking about what happened in Michigan.
Oh, so in Michigan, basically the case that was brought was rejected on the basis of not having sufficient background documentation to demonstrate that there's a value for the case. I mean, that's really going to be the big threshold, right? Is you have to be able to demonstrate and prove cause in the process of doing this. You can't just go in there on conjecture. And I think that that's one of the things, knowing sort of the rigor of the voting system, you can decide that not adequate number of ballots have been counted or that we're within, and again, they're specified by state, the margins at which you are required to do a recount and the margins at which you are not allowed to do one.
Right, right. And I think the other thing that's very interesting for teachers to be able to point out is it's not cookie cutter. It's just not cookie cutter. The states have different laws. The regions have different laws. My cousin was a election judge in DuPage County, and we compared notes on what the regulations were there versus the regulations here. We were all underneath the umbrella of the state regulations, but are there lessons that we can draw as well from that, and how we can teach students?
I just want
Dennis?
to hook on that. One of the things that was really interesting with then how the broadcast news actually handled the announcement was they waited for the Pennsylvania threshold, which is 0.5% variance between the votes, to know that they could declare it. So they actually got educated on it and actually used the rules. I think that that would actually be. I think one of the things that would be fascinating for students to do is to actually have to pull up and look at two or three states comparison to see what's different, why is it different, and how does it influence the way the election goes. And you might be able to pick a battleground state like Florida or Pennsylvania, a state that is pretty predominantly, voting in a single direction like Illinois, and then maybe another state in which, what are the two that split, where you actually don't get the full electoral college?
And Nebraska.
Yeah, those are three really interesting models.
Mhm.
And so we're
Dennis, what
moving
are your
ahead.
thoughts?
Well,
Yeah, I was
the thing
Dennis,
that
yeah.
I find interesting beyond kind of the machinations of the voting is I want to see the final numbers in terms of the third party vote. Uh, I mentioned
Mm,
before, I was somewhat enamored of Illinois' John Anderson back in 1980. We've lived through the Ross Perot era, um, the rise of Bernie Sanders, and the ability to kind of split off votes. It's very interesting that, especially on the Democratic side, the ability to get people to vote for the candidate and not to split their vote in the third party, whether this will be something that continues into the future or it doesn't. Um, I think that's an important part.
yeah. And we are far from over in that we will have, at least when we're talking about our Senate races, we will have two runoffs in Georgia, which is an interesting example. If the one does not go over the threshold of 50%, one of the candidates, then there is an automatic runoff for that, and that will happen in January with the two of them. Um, so, how do you think is there a difference in tenor and tone? Both sides would have you believe that there is. Now that that President-elect Biden has been declared president-elect, than there was, say, 4 years ago, or are we just looping? I actually went back to read President Trump's acceptance speech, and I'm going to tell you, if I closed my eyes and just and had it sounded exactly like Joe Biden's in so many ways, except of course for the moment in history of Kamala Harris being the first woman, the first woman of color. It said all of the same things of coming together with unity, and I know that you're both surprised by that. So was I. Is there a different tone? Is there a different tenor? Is this something that or is this something we have just adopted in the last decade of the?
So,
Go ahead.
so here's the thing that I think is the most fascinating is we have become so predictable in terms of the flow of events
Go ahead.
that the awarding of congratulations from France and from Canada and from England, that the entire world knows our process well enough to go, it's done, and we're moving on. And so I think that there's some really interesting sort of um, visual things taking place right now around even with the GOP reaction, how much will it matter? That at some point we are enough of a machine. Henry Ford would be super proud that we're on the track that Biden is going to be sworn in on January 16th, and the world is just managing to that path. And it, it would take just an amazing feat to change that direction at this point, and everyone is managing accordingly with the exception of a handful of folks. And that's the thing that I think is so fascinating, is to just watch everybody go, yep, they're going to move forward, and that's who's won, and this is the way it's going to go, and we're all in it together. And that's I think for me, a comfort to know that there is this ability to just sort of manage the democracy in a way that is predictable and steady.
So we're
Mhm.
closing out here, and I want to ask you, Dennis, for anything else that you want to say about this and tips and clues for teachers and educators.
Well, I think again, I would go back and say, look at the timelines and look at the candidates. I think looking at Vice President-elect Harris, um, uh, presenting a completely different appearance for what the highest office looks like. This is really exciting, and as Carol said, this peaceful transfer of power is the American brand. And so I couldn't be prouder about the system. The system appears to be working.
I think you're very well right. I know I just wanted to add in here quick for as a commercial, we are updating everything as it goes. And for those of you who are talking to your students about social media, we have added a new game that actually just came out in November from the University of Cambridge. It's been developed in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department. And I think Fritz, I think you have a Fritz. By the way, thank you very much for helping us today. Breaking Harmony Square is a social media game. It's a free online game. It's 10 minutes in the making. And if you're a parent, you can actually play this with your child. Each of you go through and it shows you what happens when misinformation comes through on social media. So it's important to remember it's a wonderful tool to help remind people that it used to be that the distribution of information was controlled by the sources, the television, the radio, and the newspapers, and its delivery. And these days, we are the distributors of information. So how do we do it responsibly? So that's an addition that I think is really fun and really I'm quite proud to talk about it. And then I'm going to pivot quickly. One more thing, and we are going to be asking you for your help. And we're probably going to come at you a couple of times. But for all those of you who don't know, John Oliver, who is a comedian as well as I think an educator himself, he has a show on HBO. It's called Last Week Tonight. And a couple of weeks ago, John Oliver did a segment on museums, and he said that about 33% of museums will probably go out of business as a result of the pandemic, according to a study. And he has offered these three wonderful, crazy pieces of art. If you know him, you'll know the backstories behind them. But these three crazy pieces of art that he is actually going to tour across the country. He's going to choose 5 museums, and those 5 museums will have these pieces of art for 2 weeks. And they will also get $10,000, and he will donate $10,000 to a local food pantry. We want that art. We have not only written the letter, we put together a video. We are in it, and we are hoping that you will go to our website, our Facebook site rather, and you will look and you will repost our Facebook post. You will retweet us on Twitter with the hashtag please give MBC, Museum of Broadcast Communications, the Art John. Please give MBC the Art John. We're going to send you some more directions through our social media to help us, but we really think that if you can help us talk to Mr. John Oliver to persuade him that we here in Chicago at the Museum of Broadcast Communication would love to have that art. We'd love to tell that story of how late night hosts like him help to influence all sorts of things. So thank you both for joining us today, and thank all of you out there. And again, have another happy half hour. We'll see you next week.